each of the people that we have asked for prayers. Amen.
Thank you. Well, last week, we talked about how the Israelites were always complaining about their situation after Moses led them out of Egypt, and they got here and they complained, and they got there and they complained. It was kind of their nature. They didn't have any water, and God sent Moses, take some of the elders and go on ahead here, and I'm going to show you where to stop and hit the rock and get water. So he did. So after all that happened, then they had to fight the Amalekites or Amalekites. Joshua was going to lead the army, and usually that was everybody from men from like 15, 60 or something, So he had to fight them, and as long as Moses held up his arms, they would win the battle, right? So after a while, you can't hold up your arms too long. What happens? They fall down. It's like when we were in the army, we were trying to hold up your M16. You got to hold it out in front of you and hold it out in front of you and hold it out in front of you, and then you finally just go like this. Well, that's what happened to Moses. So Aaron, his brother, and a man named Hur held up his arms for him. And as long as they did, and they defeated all the Amalekites or Amalekites. I don't know how y'all pronounce it the way you want to. But who were they? Who were the bunch of kites? I think one time we said there was 153 kites that we could identify maybe in the Bible. Who were the Amalekites? They were their cousins, right? Amalek or Amalemek, whatever, was the grandson of Jacob, right? So one of Esau's sons, Eliphaz, was the father of Amalek, so they were cousins. So here they are again, and that's kind of the whole situation. And part of that, when they would come and take over different people groups in Canaan and so forth, it was descendants and so, and you look back and they were descendants of Ham or Japheth, one of Noah's sons and all that. So they were all related at some point or another. So after all that took place and they defeated the Amalekites, then Moses' father-in-law Jethro shows up. And who was he? The priest of what? Midian. He was the priest of Midian. He was Moses' father-in-law. And who was Midian? One of Abraham's sons. They kin again, right? Okay. So he came and he heard about all this trouble that Moses was having with all these people and stuff. And so he shows up and he says, look, you can't continue to do all this by yourself. You can't be looking over thousands of people and everybody taken care of. So what did he tell him to do? Appoint some judges. You got to quit doing all this stuff. You got to appoint different judges. So he did. He appointed judges over 10 people and like 100 people and like 1,000 people. Different, kind of like local superior court judge and the court of appeals and the Supreme Court and stuff, right? So that's what he did. So Moses listened to Jethro, and he appointed judges for the normal stuff, and then he would only handle the serious stuff. So after all that takes place, and we don't know how long exactly it took, a couple of months or so, then they go on to get down to Mount Sinai, which is or Mount Horeb as it's called in some places. And if you look down in your back of your book at the picture there, you see where it is down in the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. And this is where God told Moses that he was going to come out in the mountain in a dark cloud and he would talk to the people. It scared the people to death. Wouldn't it you? I mean, if you're somewhere and you hear this voice, and you know it's a voice and not some imagination, you'd probably be frightened also. So they were. So Exodus 20:1-2 says, so then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. I am Lord your God. He tells them right off, I'm the one that did all this. Israel had been given all kind of commands and tests, laws and statutes and stuff they were supposed to obey. Commands and statutes to stipulate how they were expected to act as his people. They were his representatives. But in this instance, the emphasis was on how God had personally talked to the people. He communicated his will to them. And this was to impress on them that they must take him seriously. You ever had to, when you were disciplining your children when they were little, sometimes you'd talk to them in certain ways, right? And then other times you'd talk to them in more serious ways. Make them obey and listen. Patrick, kind of like the Marine drill sergeant talking to you, right? Your Marine drill sergeant, when you talk to you in a certain way, you better listen, because he's not going to tell you again. Huh? Yeah, that's right. In the rest of the Old Testament, who did God talk through? Prophets and the priest and so forth. That's how he would get his message out. But in this instance, he spoke personally. So what do we call all these words that God spoke? We call them the Ten Commandments. But in the Hebrew words, the Hebrew text, it's called the 10 words, also known as the Decalogue. Deca, 10. Okay? And why do you think there were 10 commandments? There's no real right or wrong answer to that. Some scholars think it's because you got 10 fingers. Because you can remember, that's that, 3, 4, and then you just count them down. So that's what some of the biblical scholars think. They were 10 commandments, 10 words, because we got 10 fingers and you can remember 10 things most of the time. I don't know. That's just what some of them think. But the Decalogue, it was a foundation of the whole covenant that God was making with the people. He'd made this with Abraham way back when, and now he was going to make it stick with Moses and the people. The foundation, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, was the foundation because it was being written by God himself. Oh, his finger on the stone. The covenant with Abraham and then Moses and the people and the Decalogue were being created, were equated to being equal. And that's in Deuteronomy 4 and 13. It's the same thing. The tablets of the covenant. Here they're talking about the covenant again. The tablets of the covenant. That's in Deuteronomy 9, 9, and 11. The covenant, the tablets of the covenant being placed in the ark, which represented what? The ark was what? Where God was. The ark was where God was. And it represented his presence. And it was always kept in the most holy place. You know, we talk about the Holy of Holies. The priest could go into the tent when it was a tent to a certain point. And then one time a year he could go into the Holy of Holies. But they tied a rope to his foot because if he did something wrong and died, they had to pull him back out. Okay? So all of that, the covenant that God made with Abraham and the 10 commandments of the Decalogue that he gave to Moses were equated to being equal. He said, I am the Lord your God. This is God's declaration of his grace, because without it, what good is the 10 commandments? You know, it was just nothing there. It would be pointless. There are some who believe that if you obey all the laws of the 10 commandments and others, that makes a favorable relationship with God, right? You can work your way up and you can be just fine. But what's wrong with that theory? Huh? Yeah, what else? How many of you got caught speeding? You know, whatever. You can't obey all the laws all the time, do you? Well, neither could the Israelites. You know, God knew they couldn't do it. We all know we can't do it. Romans 3:28 says, for we conclude that a person is put right with God only through faith and not by doing what the law commands. That's what Jesus was all about, changing. You can't obey all the laws. Romans 11:6 says his choice is based on his grace. Not one they have done. It's not anything people have done. It's what is based on God's grace. For if God's choice was based on what people do, then his grace would not be real grace. We're just obeying a bunch of laws and okay, we're fine. Galatians 2:16 says, yet we know that a person is put right with God only through faith in Jesus Christ, never by doing what the law requires. For no one is put right with God by doing what the law requires. No one. And in 3:10-11 says, those who depend on obeying the law live under a curse. For the scripture says, whoever does not always obey everything that is written in the book of the law is under God's curse. And now it is clear that no one is put right with God by any means of the law, because scripture says only the person who is put right with God through faith shall live. So God is telling them, listen, his grace was what preceded the whole thing. Without that, it didn't matter. So now we're going to look at Exodus 20, beginning in verse 3. He says, do not have other gods beside me. Now, did that imply that there were other gods? But what kind of gods?
Fake.
Yeah, fake or whatever. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether it is in the shape of anything that is in heaven or above or below the earth, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children, even to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. But showing love to the 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or your female servant, your livestock or the resident alien who is within the city gates. For the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. The 10 Commandments, 10 words of the Decalogue, go in two broad directions. You can figure out what those directions are? Up and out. Vertical to who? To God. Horizontal to each other, to people. Horizontal to humanity. Vertical toward God in 10 Commandments in verses 3 through 11, or 3 to 11 commandments, and then 12 through 17 is horizontal. Another way that the writer here describes how this was to affect an Israelite and his God, or our God, in 3 through 7, an Israelite and his household in 8 through 12, and an Israelite and his neighbor 13 through 16, and an Israelite in his own heart in 17. So think about how that affects those. They'd come out of Egypt where they worship what? Everything. They had, what a scarab is? Big old giant beetle. I mean, yeah, I mean, they worship beetles and everything else down there. And where they were going, to Canaan, eventually, they had all kind of gods and stuff. God instructed them to have no other gods. God was saying, hey, look, nothing can take my place. There were gods for everything, right? Gods of war, gods of weather, gods of fertility, gods of farming, gods of good luck, gods of bad luck, just everything. So if you had all these different gods, what are you doing to the authority of them? Huh? Diminishing. You're dividing it. I only got authority over this. I can't help you with that. I read the other day 2 cops somewhere, St. Louis. A man had attempted to commit suicide and shot himself, and he was still alive. And the two cops go over there and they say, well, it's about time to hit shift to end. And they left him, and he died. They went around. They said, well, we'll go drive around somewhere. We'll come back. Well, by the time they come back, another officer had found him, responded to the call, called in it, 911, the whole thing. And they showed how these two guys didn't do anything, and the poor guy died. Well, they're dividing the authority, you know. I don't help you. You know, one time a guy in New York, somebody said he got his robbed, mugged on the street, but he was on the corner of this precinct and that precinct wouldn't help him because he was across the street in the other precinct, you know. So if you're dividing authority between all these gods, who do you go to when you need an answer? That's the whole thing. But what was the real choice here? Worship the one true God. Joshua 24, 14, and 15. Of course, we have a class over the Joshua 24, 15 class. Now then, Joshua continued to honor the Lord and serve him sincerely and faithfully. Get rid of the gods which your ancestors used to worship in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and serve only the Lord. If you are not willing to serve him, decide today whom you will serve, the gods of your ancestors in Mesopotamia and the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are now living. As for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. You know, so they had everything. The Hebrew term that they used here to describe the word idol is the word pesel. You know, it refers to a man-made image that reflects what someone ultimately values. Is that always something that you can see? It's not, is it? The shape can be anything. It's kind of like an artist who sees a certain scene when he's painting. It comes to his head, so that's what he paints. A sculptor, you know, great sculptor, Michelangelo, all them. I mean, I saw one the other day on something. He carved some magnificent statue and stuff when he was like 23. I mean, just unbelievable. How about a chainsaw artist that cuts a tree trunk? I saw it on Maine Cabin Masters the other night. Had a big old tree stump sticking up about 15 feet high, and the guy carves a magnificent eagle and stuff on top of it. You know, carve anything, chainsaw anything. It's what people think. But what else could make an idol? Yeah, what could that be? Anything? They got all kind of idols in different kind of religions around the world, right? I mean, you can see them, whatever. It's anything that takes place of God. Money, politics, sports, fame, prestige, power, just about anything you wanted to substitute. But God told them in Deuteronomy 4:15, Moses said later on, when the Lord spoke to you from the fire on Mount Sinai, you did not see any form. You can't describe God in a form, in a position, in an idol, something that you make. God is above all of that. What were the three prohibitions in verse 4? Look at verse 4. He told them not to do three things. What was it? Do not make an idol. Do not bow in worship to him. And do not serve. You know, anything they do. You went all over the world in the Marines, right, Patrick? You go to Japan, Buddha, or whatever, you know. And my brother was in the Navy. He had pictures of the great big Buddha statue and all that stuff. And then, you know, India, they got cows that they walk around because they're holy things, and they're skinny and scrawny, and the people are starving to death. Yeah, you know. Do not serve any of those gods. But we got our own problems here. People serve a lot of different things. But what did God tell them? If you do these three things, if the people did so, there would be consequences all the way down to the third, and the fourth generations. You think about any situation where you might know where something has kept going from one generation to the next generation because of what somebody had done way back when. You think of anything in the history or what you may have seen? Second, third, fourth generations of rulers and so forth. What's the guy in North Korea? Huh? Whatever his name is, his father was the ruler, and his father was a ruler, and the guy that just got kicked out of Syria, his father was the ruler forever and ever, and I think his father before him and stuff, and so people have been fighting wars and stuff forever and ever. It's not just despots like that. Think about the criminal organizations like the mafia and stuff. I mean, you got one generation after the next generation, all the way back to its beginning in Italy, and they've been criminals the whole time. Some of them changed, but very few of them do. Some of them changed because the law finally catches them. But the same generations over and over and over again. Yeah, exactly. In the Bible, he goes on to say, do not misuse his name. That can be done in all kind of ways, from speaking frivolously or claiming something about him falsely. There were all kind of prophets claiming they were announcing stuff for God's benefit, but what were they really doing? They was on the deal. Paul and the other apostles had to face those situations in the New Testament times. People claiming to speak for Jesus when they didn't. Using his name falsely to claim something, profanity, or using his name to tell the truth in court, particularly, and that's called perjury. And Andy, I've seen it by times in court when he had to testify in court and saw other witnesses and stuff. Now, I've saw it many a time, working for the DA's office, and then later on probation when I had to be in court, and you just sit through a trial and something, and you get people just swear up and down that so-and-so happened, and it didn't happen, and it never happened, and wasn't going to happen, or something. Judge Barrett one time told some woman that she found this guy guilty of something. I don't remember what it was, and he said, I find him guilty no matter what you said, because I don't believe what you said. He knew she was lying as soon as she opened her mouth. So that's one way of misusing God's name, is trying to tell the truth and then lying about something. Remember the Sabbath. I guess this is one that kind of has changed over the years, I suppose. The word is related to a verb in the Hebrew word called Shabbat, meaning to cease or to rest. Labor should not only stop, but it should be replaced with a special time of devotion. Remember the Sabbath. Remembering carries the idea of honoring and recognizing the day's significance. While some other law codes contain parallels to some of the other commandments, this one was only unique to Israel. I mean, there were other codes in Hammurabi from way back when, hundreds of years before, and other situations, but this one was unique to Israel. Rest on the seventh and honor that. And then honor your father and your mother. Honor is related to a word glorify. And it's opposite of despising or treating dismissively and insignificant or unimportant. Paul said this was the first commandment with a promise. Honoring your father and mother that you may live long in the land and be prosperous and all that. The promise was that God's people would have a long life in the land they were going to. But by the time Jesus came along, the Pharisees had kind of changed that. Did anybody know what the word Corban means? C-O-R-B-A, Corban. What they would do by the time Jesus came along was, instead of taking care of their parents who, when they got old and infirm and needed help, a lot of people would say, okay, I'm going to take this money here that I got and I inherited or I earned or whatever, and I'm going to declare it for the use of the temple or the synagogue, whatever. I'm going to declare it for them. as Corbin. That's the word they use. This is going to be Corbin. So I'm going to take out all my money and I'm going to declare it for use for the Corbin instead of taking care of their parents. But what would they do instead of taking that money and they give it to the quote unquote declare it for the Corbin? They kept it. They didn't use it. They just said, okay, I'm going to declare it so that I don't have to take care of my parents. And so they had twisted it around. You know, by the time Jesus came along, the 10 Commandments had probably come 10,000. Because the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and all those people, all the stuff they were making up became like a rule. You know, it was part of that law you had to obey, you know, to be a religious person, to be properly in tune with God. You had to obey all this stuff. So they kept making up stuff and making up stuff. So that's one of the things that you didn't have to take care of your parents by his time. Or treat your parents with respect. Instead of taking care of them, they can say, okay, I'm going to declare it Corbin and then not do anything. Then he goes on, one of the other 10 words is do not murder. Now, most of the time when we were growing up, thou shalt not kill, right? It was in most of the King James versions and everything else. Well, there's different words. The Hebrew word here is rashat, best I can say it. And it appears over 40 times in Scripture and relates to an unauthorized killing, murder. It didn't deal with war. It didn't deal with an accidental death. Some people use the King James Version, thou shalt not kill, to say capital punishment is wrong and not biblical. But the word, it should be, thou shalt not murder. You know, instead of thou shalt not kill. You know, justify not being able to use capital punishment. But there's certain things in the Bible that God said, you know, you do this and you shall die. Among those was adultery, which was one of 16 capital crimes in Israel. In many places in the world, even today, adultery can only be committed by a woman. Because that's what they believe. What did Jesus say to the woman who was caught in the act? Yeah, but what did he first say to the group in the crowd? Throw the first stone. And then he told them, woman, where are your accusers? Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. But if you look at some of the places around the world, they get really stuck on those kind of things. Do not steal. This was more than just taking something that does not belong to you. It also means taking advantage of someone through false representation, and including not paying them a fair wage for their work, or charging high interest rates on loans. I got something the other day, I don't know, MasterCard or somebody, they raised their interest rates on like 27%. Gee, no wonder some people can't ever get out of debt, you know. The Hebrew term ganab refers to taking something by deception or stealth, sneaking away. The term gazal usually refers to taking something by force or violence or even exploiting the poor. So there were several different ways that they could steal from the different folks. He said, do not give false testimony. That refers to a court setting, legal setting. But it can also mean gossip, which is usually repeating information that we know is probably false and probably harmful. Deception shatters relationships, and since the Israelites were to be God's people, they needed to reflect His character and be truthful at all times. We should too. But unfortunately, I'm sure we don't. He says, do not covet. That's the one that's addressed in our thoughts. That's where he's talking about an Israelite and his heart. It's not wrong to desire stuff, is it? It's just wrong to desire what somebody else has got. You know, well, I'm going to work harder and I'm going to save my money and I'm going to buy one of those too, instead of just stealing it or something else.
It's like jealousy.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. This is the one commandment that was not subject to human legislation. All the other ones can be legislated, and you can prove somebody did something, you know, he broke the law. This one deals with motive. You covet somebody else had. And these 10 words, the 10 commandments, form the whole foundation of what God's people, for God's people, and how they were supposed to live their lives. It's not so much as a law as it is a principle. These 10 principles of how they were supposed to live their life, how they were supposed to be God's people and represent Him to all the other people in those parts of the world that they were coming into contact with. But unfortunately, like us and like them, it didn't last too long, did it? Anybody got anything they want to add? Tom?
Yeah, I've got a sad story. I was talking to a lawyer, a young lawyer once, and I asked him, what are the laws? And then he started talking about bills and stuff that's been passed. He didn't understand. He didn't comprehend the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
I don't think he even heard of it. And that's sad.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if they're there now, but the Ten Commandments used to be in the state capitol in all of our states. I don't.
Most of the things have been removed by the ACLU and folks. We had a guy on probation one time, and one of the ladies was talking to him, and he didn't know, ever even heard about 10 minutes. Said, "Thou shalt not steal," because that's what he was on probation for, was stealing. And she tried to go in and explain to him the biblical foundation for all that. Of course, nowadays, if somebody found out about it and told on her, she'd probably lose her job. You know, but he didn't know about it because his whole family had been generationally doing what? Stealing and being crooks, you know. It's like the guys I told y'all about years ago, the kid in Athens that shot the boy at the fraternity house after a football game. His daddy was in the mafia in Atlanta. You know, there weren't great big mafia clans in Atlanta, but they were connected to the mafia out of New York, New Jersey, and places. You know, so that was his whole family life situation. If you ever get a chance to read a book or hear about Michael Franzese, he was called the Yuppie Don, one of the Yuppies back in the 80s. He was a Yuppie. You know, he was in charge of one of the big mafia clans in New York. You know, there's 5 families in New York named after certain mafia characters. Well, he got caught skimming deals where they were paying gasoline. You had to pay the gas tax. And the last person who got the gas, like at the service station or whatever, had to pay the tax. Well, they just kept inventing dummy corporations and stuff over and over and over and over and over. And by the time it got down to there where they got the money, nobody knew who was who. But he finally got caught and went to federal prison for a couple of times. Then he met a woman and he became a Christian. And he has a book. If you can ever look it up, you look it up on Amazon. He's written several books, and he gives testimonials of different shows and stuff. But his father was John Sonny Franzese, and he lived to be like 100 years old. He was one of the original, not original, but long-time mafia head guy in New York. But his book is From the Godfather to God the Father. How he changed his life. He was the don of one of the groups, and you know, so that's interesting to read. But his whole family, you know, generation, it's all that 3rd and 4th generation stuff, you know, over and over again. Anybody got anything else you want to add? Sandra, would you close us, please?